session on brownfields, a roundtable. Of course, this is the third in an ongoing series. We'll continue in the new year as well. I'm glad to see so many people show up to this. It's great. My name is Lachlan MacKinnon. I'm a historian at Cape Breton University in Canada, and I'm a Canada Research Chair in Post-Industrial Communities. And I'll be chairing the session today. So I'd also like to start with a big thanks to Lauren for hashing out some of the technical details and getting all of this sorted out. So thanks very much, Lauren. So before we actually get started, I'm just going to go through a couple of the technical and kind of logistical issues that we're going to run through this meeting. So first, and I see that almost everybody has done this already, if you could mute your microphones when you're not speaking, that will help with the audio. Also, I'd just like to note that our session today is being recorded for archival purposes, and only the speakers' presentations, though, will be shared publicly at a later date. During the presentations, feel free to use the chat box to address any technical issues or for kind of general chat purposes, or for sharing kind of links and resources that you think might be valuable or applicable to what you're hearing. In terms of presenters, they will be notified by myself when they have 1 minute left. I'll kind of wave to the screen, and also I'll send a private message in the chat. So that will give you an idea of how much time you have left. And in terms of the presentations, they're going to be followed by a question and answer session at the very end. So please save the questions for the end after we hear everybody present. And when you share your questions, you can share them either in the chat or use the raise hand function through Zoom. So I think that's in participants, and then you click the raise hand icon, and that will automatically place you in a list of who raises their hand first. So I will know which order to give the floor in. Okay, so that's it for kind of technical details. Oh, one further thing, I would like to note that you'll notice on the session today, we're sorry to be missing Sean O'Connell. He was scheduled to present, but he's unable to make it today because as part of another project that Sean's working on, it involves authoring an official report on the history of Magdalen laundries in Northern Ireland. And as a result of that report, Sean and his co-author are scheduled to deliver remarks to senior civil servants there today. And so he unfortunately has to miss our session. And of course, we miss him here today, but we wish him the best in the important work that he's doing in Northern Ireland as well. So today in our session, we're going to be examining the meaning and significance of brownfields in different national contexts. Now, brownfield sites are frequently the product of the deindustrialization process, and therefore they elicit a variety of responses and encompass a host of meanings for former workers, neighborhoods, urban developers, artists, and politicians. These sites, I think, lay bare the violence of industrial closure, but so too are they sometimes rhetorically used kind of in popular discourse to justify the sorts of urban renewal efforts that continue to displace working class communities in a variety of ways, through things like gentrification and so on. So as a result, brownfields often find themselves at the heart of much discourse surrounding deindustrialization. They're politicized as either urban blight or sites of risk, or a site of toxification. Of course, this is something that's been explored throughout historical and scientific literature as well. On the other hand, they've often been positioned as spaces of memory. They're former workplaces where displaced men and women ground much of their sense of occupational identity. Many of their solidarities are grounded in that experience of the former workplace, and so on. And from even other quarters, these brownfield sites have often found themselves aesthetized and romanticized through art or practices such as kind of urban exploration or things of that nature. Now, our presenters today will be exploring these and other meanings of brownfields in a variety of national contexts. And I look forward very much to hearing what each of them has to say. So I'll take this opportunity to welcome our first panelist, Jana Golombek. Jana is a doctoral student and researcher at the Institute for Social Movements at the Ruhr University of Bochum. She's involved in the project, the Ruhr region, a global beacon for industrial heritage, or she was involved in that project. She has also worked as a researcher at the German Mining Museum in Bochum in a project on industrial heritage, and is currently a collaborator on our depot partnership. So welcome, Jana, and feel free to take the floor.
Thank you, Lachlan. I'm sorry, but I have some technical difficulties, which makes me unable to read my text, actually, and to share the screen. So I probably have to restart my laptop. I'm so sorry. Is it possible that someone else starts and I'll handle the problem in the meantime?
Yeah.
Sorry for that.
That's not a problem, Jana. Okay, so we'll move ahead to our...
back, I promise.
Yeah, no, that's no problem. Okay, so we'll move ahead now then to our second listed presenter. Our second presenter today is going to be James Rhodes. James is a sociologist with affiliations at the University of Manchester and Hiram College in Ohio. His research explores the situated lived experiences of deindustrialization and related processes of depopulation and urban decline. He's also examined far-right politics, the concept of the left behind, focusing on the northwest of England. And he also researches issues related to urban decline, such as depopulation in the Rust Belt, or state policy related to urban shrinkage and that sort of thing. So welcome, James.
Thanks, Lachlan. I'll share my screen now. So I'm actually talking about kind of not necessarily brownfields, but the stigma that becomes directed at poor sort of marginalized residential neighborhoods. But hopefully, I'm going to introduce this concept of territorial stigma, but hopefully in doing that, you'll also see the kind of utility of this concept for looking at brownfield sites as well. So I've kind of written this out, which is unusual for me, but I kind of wanted to be a bit more organized than normal. And so I wanted to start with this map. So this is a map of Youngstown, Ohio, and its near suburbs where I live at the moment. And it circulates online, and Youngstown's a kind of iconic deindustrialized city. And I think it's a map which neatly illustrates what I'm talking about today, which is how in the context of economic restructuring, sort of race and class segregation, and really pronounced social and spatial disparities, specific spaces come to be stigmatized. So you can see here, you've got this designation effectively of almost the whole city of Youngstown as a ghetto. There's this idea of the kind of war zone that exists there, the near ghetto. And I found my own street, and apparently like I live in a drug area at the moment, although it seems very, very sedate to deserve that designation of a drug area. But I would argue that the question of stigma has been integral to the experience of deindustrialization. So deindustrialization marked not just the material devastation of industrial communities, but was accompanied by forms of cultural and symbolic marginalization and stigmatization. As many towns and cities struggled to rebound from the disinvestment it wrought, they came to be positioned as sites of loss, decay, abandonment, and dysfunction. And we see these negative tropes persist today through the tendency to view places like Detroit through the lens of ruin and abandonment. And similarly, this persists in the context of the rise of right-wing populism as people and places come to be viewed as left behind, positioned as regressive, existing outside of progressive development, and inhabiting a space on the wrong side of history. But I would argue, deindustrialization doesn't only produce marked regional disparities, but within towns and cities, deindustrialization is deeply implicated in deepening forms of socio-spatial polarization and inequality. And in this context, we see how neighborhoods and their inhabitants come to be subjected to forms of symbolic denigration. So in this, I was going to introduce this concept of territorial stigmatization and kind of explore some of the ways in which it's been kind of applied through research. And again, I think it's a really useful concept for us in studying deindustrialization. So the concept of territorial stigma, it was coined by the French sociologist Loic Wacquant, and for him, it represents a defining feature of contemporary processes of marginalization and inequality. So it's based on the kind of bringing together of Goffman's focus on social stigma and Pierre Bourdieu's work on symbolic violence and power. And McQuant argues that the breakdown of the Fordist Keynesian post-war system of production through deindustrialization and economic restructuring, as well as the ascendancy of market-oriented neoliberal forms of governance and welfare retrenchment, have marked the onset since the 1980s of a regime of what he calls advanced marginality. And he argues that this process has produced forms of deproletarianization, and it's also heightened spaces of relegation. And it means that the inhabitants of which are subject to demoralizing forms of territorial stigma, which he argues is associated with living in a bounded urban area, publicly regarded as a place of relegation and widely equated with social failure, destitution, and crime. And he argues that this kind of like really crystallized at the century's end. And he argues that this is, not only do people face the kind of material consequences of these transformations, but these material consequences are compounded by the kind of like symbolic stigma people face. He argues that there comes to be this symbolic degradation attached to living in locales widely labelled as no-go areas, fearsome redoubts rife with crime, lawlessness, and moral degeneracy, where only the rejects of society could bear to live. And again, what's interesting is he argues that while there are kind of variations in this across different nations and political contexts, he argues that it's a defining feature of what he calls first world metropolises. So formerly sort of industrial capitalist countries. He argues this is a kind of recurrent feature of them. And in his kind of formulation of this, he largely saw stigma as being directed towards areas that were disproportionately populated by racial and ethnic minorities. But other scholars more recently, people like Anoop Nayak, have also pointed to the way in which white working class neighborhoods come to be targeted through this stigma as well. And I think a really important point for Waquan is that this stigma has real consequences. It's symbolic in nature, but material in its consequences. And so, I suppose the most obvious kind of question is, well, who produces this stigma? And Waquan argues that stigma is primarily produced from above, as he describes it. So he argues that it's kind of a set of images externally imposed upon residential areas and residents, principally by the state, housing and labour markets, and private actors, corporate actors, but also by specialists in symbolic production. So he identifies the media, journalists, scholars, policy analysts, and politicians as all playing a key role in this. And again, it's interesting that studies of deindustrialization by, for instance, Lincoln and Russo, O'Hara's analysis of Gary, they all point to the role that kind of national media plays in this. And clearly the national and local state is a key actor in terms of, what stigmatization through welfare policy and reform, its approaches to poverty, regeneration, and redevelopment. But interestingly, more recent work has also pointed to the way in which this can operate at a meso level. So Kudler and Corey note the role that business improvement areas play in the stigmatization of particular neighborhoods as a way to sort of justify particular models of regeneration. And I know James Patterson, who's affiliated to the project, he looks at the operation of territorial stigma in a mining village in England, and he also highlights the role that community groups actually play in the reproduction of stigma. And that's something I've also found in Youngstown when I observed in like neighborhood block watch meetings as well. And I think as urban governance becomes more complex and more dispersed, and community groups and non-profits assume more significant roles, particularly in context of urban austerity, it's interesting to think about the role they might play within stigmatization. Kath Newman, for instance, in her study of the activities of the community development corporations in Newark, New Jersey, noticed how CDCs played a really active role in reproducing negative classed and racialized views of renters, for instance. But this also operates at the micro level, and my own work in Burnley shows how kind of residents themselves also engage in these stigmatizing representations. So residents would refer to stigmatized Asian areas, but also what they term scruffy white areas as a kind of basis for social and spatial distinction. And Waquan refers to this as a process of lateral denigration, where residents can stigmatize those in other similarly deprived neighborhoods, but also engage in forms of disaffiliation from fellow residents in the same area. And again, this is something I've observed in Youngstown. Black and white residents, homeowners, are highly critical of renters, particularly renters that are in receipt of Section 8 housing vouchers. And another interesting thing here relates to the kind of timing and temporality of stigma. So Waquan argues that this kind of really sort of developed from the 1980s onwards, and he sees it as this kind of feature of, as I said, of this age of advanced marginality. but other people have kind of questioned this. So Alice Butler-Walk, who conducted a kind of historical analysis of the stigma directed at Toxteth in Liverpool, argues that there are earlier foundational forms of stigma that existed, and that actually these foundational forms of stigma become a basis upon which this more recent territorial stigma is kind of premised upon. And we also might think about the role that earlier forms of place-based stigma played in things like urban renewal and slum clearance in both the US and the UK. Lloyd and Bonds, who've analysed the stigma directed at a poor black neighbourhood in Milwaukee, they also point to the kind of longer histories of redlining, segregation, racism, and racial capitalism as being crucial to the origins of stigma, and that occurred actually prior to deindustrialization, even though they see deindustrialization as kind of changing the shape and kind of force of stigma. And I think it also might make us think about the role that stigma might have played in the advent and development of deindustrialization. So the suburbanization of people and industry in the US, for instance, was not only driven by material transformations such as new infrastructure, greater supplies of available unpolluted land, tax incentives, but it was also related to the stigmatization of inner city areas, of industrial plants, and of workers, workers as radicals, for instance. Jason Hackworth points to the way in which conservative think tanks and politicians orchestrated the organized deprivation of the Rust Belt, with disinvestment being legitimated via the perceived racial and moral threat posed by the black inner city. And again, it's interesting about why the specific neighborhoods get targeted while others don't. And as I said, for Waquan, stigma is not simply symbolic, but it's kind of really consequential. And he argues that one of the general consequences of stigma is the way it works to sever marginalized areas and those residing in them from the broader socio-political structures of caste and class domination, of which it is both an instrument and a product. And so he argues that these areas come to be explained not by kind of structural forces and the actions of the kind of state and private corporations, but instead they come to be explained by the supposed cultural and moral pathology of the inhabitants. And he argues that this leads to increased disinvestment, it depresses property values, and it leads to avoidance by outsiders. He also argues that it can serve to justify what he calls structural violence from above, so further institutional withdrawal and the intensified surveillance and policing. And again, we can also connect these stigmatizing representations to welfare reform. It's really interesting that the moralizing discourses of an underclass have really resurfaced significantly since the 1980s and the 1990s in the wake of deindustrialization. And Lloyd and Bonds, again, they focus on this zip code in Milwaukee, which has the highest rate of incarceration in America. And they talk about the way in which the kind of stigma directed at the neighborhood obscures the roles that decades of deindustrialization and labor assaults, metropolitan racial and wealth segregation, and public school and welfare restructuring play in producing racial and class inequality. And they argue instead these stigmatizing discourses focus on racializing tropes about black on black crime, broken homes, and uncaring communities, which legitimates not only disinvestment, but more punitive forms of policing. And again, lots of other studies, in fact, probably most studies of territorial stigma have looked at the way in which it kind of comes to be used to justify the civilizing processes of regeneration and gentrification. And Waquan also argues that on the ground level, it effectively furthers this process of like class fragmentation and decomposition. So he argues that it leads to forms of symbolic splintering where residents kind of, scapegoat, minorities, immigrants, drug dealers, single mothers, and this creates a further sort of fragmentation of these communities. And again, this can be particularly important in deindustrialized areas where there's often been significant neighborhood change and where there are very pronounced racial and class disparities inscribed in place. I think another really interesting angle here is the focus on the health consequences of it. So people like Garthwaite and Bambra, they argue that spatial stigma is a social determinant of health, both in terms of the way in which it directly affects health outcomes through like the internalization of stigma, through heightened anxiety about the neighborhood in which you live, and through withdrawal from social networks. But they argue that it also influences the structural conditions that shape health. So the presence of institutions and also the way in which institutions might treat you on the basis of the assumptions they make about you based on where you live. But I think another thing that's perhaps been neglected as well is in the American context, the stigmatization of poor neighborhoods is often not related to gentrification, but is related to further disinvestment. So a number of so-called legacy cities in America that have consistently shed people and jobs for decades are currently seeking to stabilize their environments through forms of what have been termed right-sizing or urban triage. And in these contexts, neighborhoods that are designated as weak and possessing extreme levels of vacancy and abandonment, these designations work to further marginalize residents who are usually disproportionately black and poor. So this is a map of Youngstown. The purple areas are designated, this was a neighborhood plan produced in 2014. The purple areas are areas that are designated as extremely weak. And that's based on indicators like high calls to police, high rates of unemployment, high poverty rates, high vacancy rates, low rates of home ownership, and low house sale prices. And then this basically, the designation of your neighborhood determines what type of resources you get. So if you're in an extremely weak neighborhood, pretty much all you get from the city is things like your grass being cut, they'll demolish and clear up blight, but there's no plans for kind of significant reinvestment in those neighborhoods because they argue it's beyond the capacity of the local government to do so. And again, I think it also shows the way in which stigmatization doesn't always work through sort of sensationalist tropes of, you know, kind of the ghetto, the inner city, but even these kind of seemingly prosaic designations of, you know, weak, constrained, extremely weak, can really sort of shape the fate of neighborhoods following deindustrialization. And Manuel Alves argues that, reflecting on Cleveland's approach to planned shrinkage, he argues that maps actually make geography. So these representational devices like actually serve to, you know, have material consequences. And I think this is really important because I read a recent report where it says that in most legacy cities, the prevalence of continuing abandonment and decline is much more common than the experience of economic growth or gentrification. So I read something in the 8 most populous areas of Ohio, for every one person that's living in a neighborhood that's experiencing economic growth and gentrification, there are over 40 residents that are living in neighborhoods that are experiencing deepening poverty and decline. And then a final part of this is the way stigma is resisted. So Anoop Nayak wrote a really great paper recently about Middlesbrough in Teesside in England. And he talks about how the ways residents kind of actively can resist stigma through what he called the re-scripting of place. So he argues that, you know, residents actively challenge these negative stereotypes, emphasizing instead things like kinship, care, thick community relations, local pride, industrial history and heritage, and the kind of qualities of the landscape. And he argues that this was kind of sort of sporadic and fleeting, but he argues that at a particular moment, it kind of sedimented into more organized forms of resistance to negative media coverage, government neglect, and corporate restructuring. So too, Cairns' study of Black and Latinx youth in Camden, New Jersey, she found that residents kind of sort of critiqued these forms of stigma by drawing on Camden's past history, the presence of kind of active community groups who were seeking to make a difference, but also through local sports teams and athletes. So young people sought to find good in the city, and through this challenge stereotypes. So too, Gareth Thomas's study of Merthyr, a former steel town in South Wales, found similar things. And Sherry Lincoln's recent work around this phenomenon of Rust Belt chic, you know, we can kind of also see this where a kind of younger generations are sort of re-signifying the meanings of these spaces. But again, I suppose there are tensions with this. Gareth Thomas notes, for instance, that in constructing more positive representations of place, the young people he encountered in South Wales often in turn negatively stigmatized other areas. So they simply redirected the stigma from their area to another one. And then we can also think about the ways in which kind of stigma can become commodified. So if we think about the Levi's advertising campaign in Braddock from around 2010, if we think about the GM Prize, the imported from Detroit media campaigns, and again, there can also be maybe a tendency where it might actually work to downplay real social problems and kind of tend towards sort of boosterism. But I'll finish there. Hopefully that was about right in terms of time.
Yeah. Thanks so much, James. So is Jana back yet, or?
No, not yet. Yeah, so I guess we can go on to the next.
Okay, so while we're waiting for Jana, we'll move ahead to Stephen High. Stephen is a professor of history at Concordia University and the vice president of the Canadian Historical Association. Stephen is an interdisciplinary oral and public historian with a long interest in working class studies and deindustrialization. His research focuses on transnational working class histories, issues of forced migration, community engaged research, and a lot of great stuff on oral history methodology and ethics. And Stephen is also the principal investigator of the deindustrialization and the politics of our time project. So welcome, Stephen, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks so much, Lachlan, and thanks, James. That was amazing. My hands sore from writing so quickly. It was like so much there, and I think this notion of territorial stigmatization is going to be really important for the wider project. And I found like your take on that really valuable. And I think what I'm going to say now is it sort of connects with what you were speaking of, but perhaps from a slightly different angle. So Industrial Sunset, The Making of North America's Rust Belt, which was my first book, I wrote about how manufacturing moved out of crowded inner city areas to suburban industrial parks or the countryside. These greenfield sites, a term that emerged in the 1950s, offered industries the opportunity to distance themselves from the growing stigma attached to smokestack industries in the inner city, as well as cheaper non-union labor. The term brownfield emerged in the 1970s and 1980s to differentiate the redevelopment of former industrial lands from the first-time development of so-called greenfield sites. The US Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, defines brownfields as, and I quote, abandoned, idled, or underused industrial and commercial facilities where expansion or redevelopment is complicated by real or perceived environmental contamination. So I think the or perceived part, I think, is really quite interesting. In 2005, the EPA estimated that there were 450,000 brownfield sites in the US alone. Most of these are located in close proximity to historically poor and minority communities. Differing definitions of brownfields, however, make cross-national comparisons difficult. In Canada, they are defined as, quote, abandoned, idle, or underutilized commercial or industrial property, so they reverse the commercial industrial from the Americans, where past actions have caused known or suspected environmental contamination. But this is the important part, but where there is an active potential for redevelopment, right? So brownfields only become brownfields if actually they're being targeted or as potential redevelopment sites. In Europe, the Concerted Action on Brownfields and Economic Regeneration Network, or Cabernet, which I wonder who thought that one up, has found that brownfield definitions vary considerably across the European Union. It also has to be said that the availability of national data on the number of brownfields and the geographic area covered is incomplete, uneven, or out of date. For example, as far as I know, the UK National Land Use Database was last updated in 2004, as was the Scottish Vacant and Derelict Land Survey. But there's a wider meaning of brownfields that I want to speak to. Carol Armstrong, who wrote her 2007 PhD thesis on the social construction of brownfields, argues that, quote, brownfields trace their roots to complex social processes, including deindustrialization, that have left degraded, neglected land in primarily urban neighborhoods. Indeed, the term brownfield infers value judgments not only about brownfield property owners and occupants, but also about the communities in which they exist. Armstrong is making an essential point here, and one that I'd like to explore further. Blighted neighborhoods can persist far longer than abandoned industrial sites themselves. You might even say that the slum or ghetto, along with the regional idea of the Rust Belt, represents the ultimate brownfield area. Industrial cities across North America during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s were torn apart or left to rot. The territorial stigmatization of racialized urban poverty has a long history. Historian Benjamin Looker, who's written a great book on the urban neighborhood as a concept, makes an important distinction between urban slums, typically coded as white, which are usually overcrowded and highly profitable for landlords, and blighted areas, often coded as black, marked by abandonment and lost profitability. Blight, a term that originated in a parasite that killed farm crops, crept into the urban imaginary It was understood in racialized terms. The urban crisis, at least in the United States, was understood as a racial problem, essentially. Geographer Jason Hackworth, for one, has made the case that land abandonment was not simply an economic process, but is a racial one as well. It was no coincidence that extreme land abandonment in the United States was mostly located in historically Black urban neighborhoods. By comparison, many declining white working class neighborhoods were viewed in more positive terms. The publication of The Urban Villagers by Herbert Gons in 1962, which focused on an Italian-American neighborhood in Boston's West End while it was being demolished, and Jane Jacobs' classic, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which paid tribute to Greenwich Village in New York City, did much to mythologize white ethnic urban neighborhoods. For some, these urban villages are remembered as lost urban Edens of stability and authenticity. That said, if territorial stigmatization and bulldozing of racialized parts of the city was a central feature of the 20th century urban history, it remains important to recognize that this territorial stigmatization extended to areas inhabited mainly by poor whites. As we've already heard, a case in point is the important research of James Rhodes on the former textile town of Burnley in the UK that saw the impoverishment of its largely white working class. Once viewed as dangerously mobile, the deindustrialized working class is now seen as immobilized by history. Immobility has acquired the connotation of defeat or failure, of being left behind, of being fixed in place. Poor people and poor places can thus be blamed for their own lowly condition rather than wider structural forces. Blighted urban areas often become a dumping ground, as brownfield sites and abandoned buildings are recycled for waste disposal, recycling centers, landfills, and incinerators. Historian Andrew Hurley reminds us that affluent whites, quote, usually manage to monopolize those areas with the least congestion, cleanest air, and most pleasing vistas. For Hurley, environmental activism emerged out of the effort to protect those physical features of residential life, fresh air, pastoral landscapes, and open space that had become central components of middle-class identity. Not surprisingly, then, the gentrification of old industrial neighborhoods is preceded by its environmental and aesthetic cleanup, regenerating working-class brownfields for middle-class futures. The language of gentrification reflects this middle-class greening process, and this is something I think we'll talk about in the next roundtable. I hope we do anyways. I'd like to conclude with the words of François Duchesne and Christelle Morel-Journel, who have argued that the idea of the Parisian banlieue, or suburb, associated as they are with racialized minorities and urban outcasts, is itself an act of erasure of what were once industrial towns and cities. The same might be said of the urban ghetto or slum in North America. All of these stigmatized places were, in fact, made poor. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Great paper. So I believe Jana is ready to go next. Yes, okay, so thank you again to Stephen. And now I'd like to welcome our third presenter today, Jana Golombek. So feel free to take it away, Jana.
Thank you, Lachlan. I'm trying to share my screen now. Oops. And sorry again for this distraction in the beginning. My laptop completely crashed and I could only restore some, not all of my text, but I think I'm going to be good. So sorry for that, for the bumpy start. So you can see my presentation? Okay, great. So I'm sorry that I missed James' presentation, but I think as we're all presenting different aspects of this brownfield topic and we're discussing later on, there will be some time to be back on track. So as today we are talking about brownfields, and my job is to give a short introduction to specify on the German expression, as we want to be able to know what we are talking about and what the differences and similarities are. I will start with some definitions, then I will focus on concepts and strategies real quick and on specifics of dealing with brownfields in the rural area. So the German expression for brownfields is Industriebrache, or simply Brache, whereas the word Brache can be traced back to the 8th century and is an agricultural term referring to a piece of land or a field that lies fallow in order for the soil to recover. And of course, in the agricultural context, the Brache was part of the principle of the three-field rotation and thus part of a planned circulatory system, whereas of course the Industriebrache or brownfield doesn't necessarily have a future and rather has some negative connotations, as we already heard as well. So I gathered some of them just to, have a look at that. So redeveloping a brownfield meant not knowing which kind of pollution or contamination you might be dealing with. And of course, there often was no use for so much space. Plus the key industries in the ruhr, for example, were in decline, but the mining companies still held enough power and land to prevent new industries from settling down in the region in the 1960s, as they considered the crisis to be only temporary and did not want to let competitors in like the automotive, electrical, or chemical industries. Thus, companies like Ford, Volkswagen, and Schering took their business elsewhere, and only Opel managed to come to the ruhr, but only because the city of Bochum kept it very secret that Opel was trying to do so. So there's that. And through the oil crisis in the 1970s, the number of brownfields, of course, increased, while the demand for them and the financial flexibility of municipalities decreased. So as a result, there was no more capital to promote the reuse of the brownfields and reactivate them. Today, revitalization, restructuring, and conversion are some of the most important fields of urban planning, and the wording has drastically changed. So terms like adaptive reuse, temporary use, Zwischennutzung in German, or conversion, Umnutzung, or space for possibilities, which I find like a really, it's called Möglichkeitsräume in German, space for possibilities. It's such a positive connotation for, a brownfield. And this field became very popular over the last decade or so, and of course also in the context of the Ruhr being cultural capital in 2010. So as for the definitions, there's only this one legal definition by the Landschaftsgesetz North Rhine-Westphalia and some mentioning in the Baugesetzbuch. Yes, so the one legal definition can be found in the landscape law of North Rhine-Westphalia that defines brownfields as properties whose management has been given up or that haven't been in use for more than 3 years. It used to be 5 years in the 80s, but now it's down to 3 years, unless plans for reuse have been set in motion. So the legal text indicates 3 characteristics of brownfields: the non-existence of management, a temporal component of this lack of use, at least 3 years or 5 years, as I mentioned, and of course the status as unplanned area in terms of city planning. And the Baugesetzbuch, so the building code, doesn't define the term, but mentions it as the reuse of brownfields is considered to be an urban planning measure that allows the municipality to serve the public good and declare a brownfield as development sector to build housing or other buildings of public interest. There were first attempts to define the term Brachfläche from an urban planning perspective in Germany in the early 1980s. Depending on the academic discipline of the author, the definitions vary in their sharpness of detail, so that there's no consistency in the definitions. So I put together some of the criteria that they have in common. So that it is a formerly anthropogenic area. How it has been used is irrelevant as long as it was an economic purpose or related to urban development. The area is no longer in demand, which is why investors, owners, or users have withdrawn. it's thus turned inoperable economically. A new use with a more permanent character hasn't been found yet, and the area is therefore not used at all, underused, or only used temporarily. The condition of the area prevents economic reuse. To enable a reactivation, planning and urban development measures are necessary. And of course, the temporal component I already mentioned, that the points mentioned above have been valid for at least 3 years. So as for the regional focus, the development of brownfields has of course been a topic in the last decades and has been central to different efforts. I only want to mention 3 of them that show different stages of development. So the Aktionsprogramm Ruhr, Action Program Ruhr from 1979 was a program of measures initiated by the state of North Rhine-Westphalia for the Ruhr area. And as earlier programs, it was meant to modernize the region with measures developed and implemented by the state government. In the context of the different phases of North Rhine-Westphalian structural policy, it was described as a phase of neo-industrialization, where the government wasn't at all looking beyond coal and steel to build a future for the region, but was only trying to modernize those industries. Concerning the brownfield management, a property fund was set up that was supposed to cover the costs to reactivate brownfields, especially from the mining sector, and prevent urban sprawl and the disintegration of the region. One of the most significant events in the history also of industrial heritage and the Ruhr was of course the International Building Exhibition Emscher Park, which has already been mentioned in previous workshops, so I won't go into detail there. But of course, yeah, the brownfields were regarded as part of regional culture and brought into focus of city planners with this building exhibition. And another measure is the installation of a company that helps the municipalities and cities in North Rhine-Westphalia in developing and planning. And it came up in 2009. I quote from the website, the NRW Urban is an affiliated company of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia and supports cities and municipalities as a strong partner in location development, building land development for residential and commercial space development, and in the revitalization of brownfields. So different concepts and strategies have been used in dealing with brownfields. They are linked to different phases that I want to identify real quick. And of course, there was a phase where brownfields were just ignored and not used at all, so I'm not gonna go into detail there. But the first phase was characterized by the destruction of everything that was there. Buildings were demolished. No one was looking for biotopes or thought about the aesthetic value of the buildings, and the focus was on developing a new production site. Then how much time do I have left? Okay, just to check. Okay, great. The next phase was characterized by the search for new uses for the brownfields, and no, let's skip that. And there was still hope, of course, to attract new industries, but also certain awareness that this might not work out, and the number of brownfields increases and building new housing or office space doesn't or didn't fill them anymore. In the third phase, there are so many brownfields that they can't all be used, and is characterized by an upcoming awareness of certain characteristics of the brownfields. Buildings are put under protection, remains are being valued for their historical significance, and remembering the social impact of deindustrialization becomes an important aspect of brownfield management, at least in some parts. And in the fourth phase, of course, there's an emphasis on minimal and cheap intervention in order to increase the attractiveness and support new activities in order to better face the social and economic hardships caused by deindustrialization. So the symbolic reorganization gains importance. Okay, I'm going to skip this. So there are some strategies, of course, linked to those different phases. I'm going to go back here. The strategies, so transformation into a new industrial site, the past as future, culture as heritage, the museumization, touristification of the region, nature-related solutions, of course, greening, which we dive into deeper in the next session, like Industrienatur, for example, industrial nature, and of course the aesthetics linked to the building and nature. So I have some examples here. some pictures, so you might have a look. So this is one of the early things that happened. This is in Oberhausen, the Neue Mitte, the new city center. So they built a shopping mall on the grounds of a former Thyssen site, and yeah, that's the first idea that came into mind, to put up a shopping mall. Then, of course, in the phase where industrial heritage mattered, I have to promote our own museum, the Industrial Museum, with 8 different sites that got saved and put under protection and became technical monuments. Of course, the Zollern Colliery that had the machine hall that was put under protection in 1969 and was the first technical monument in North Rhine-Westphalia. And of course, the landscape park in Duisburg, which also stands for the concept of Industrienatur, industrial nature, and the concept of greening, which I will talk about in the next session a little bit more. And to finish, I have an example. Also, the picture you can see in the backdrop of my presentation is from an area in Dortmund, from the Hösch Bundwand, a factory that was closed in 2016. Then for some years, nothing happened. Now an investor has bought it, and they are trying to redevelop the whole area. And there's a group of people, they have been there for 10 years now, the Urbanisten, and it's a group of city planners, architects, and other people that promote the citizen engagement and want to let people have a say in what happens to this area. Of course, it's not really working out as far as I know. I mean, I've followed very closely, and you can see the area in the backdrop. And of course, the residential area, which is very close, and it's a piece of land that is really close to the city center and to the central station. So, I mean, everybody wants a part in it. The Urbanisten, they started really early in having cafes and stuff like that to ask the citizens of this area what they would want to have. And there were planning processes, and they tried to get in contact with the city, because they've been there for 10 years. So they are really an established organization. But now there's the plans are that the university will move there. There's going to be a lake, some housing, some shops and stuff like that. So very, I don't know, not very innovative, and not really in dialogue with the people living there. So my ending question would be, how can we help with our project to shape the next phase of dealing with brownfields, and how we can help to improve? As also, including myself, there are a lot of practitioners working in this field, not only analyzing, but also hoping to change something, as I think we all want to. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jana. That was a great look at how brownfields are being treated in the Ruhr, which might match with, or maybe differs from, how these areas are kind of looked at in a lot of other countries that are involved in the project. So thanks so much for the presentation. So moving on, next we're going to have a presentation from Keith Gildart, who is a professor of labor and social history at the University of Wolverhampton. Keith's research focuses on 19th and 20th century coal mining, British history, labor movement and working class politics in the UK, as well as youth culture and popular music as well. Keith has published widely on issues relating to British labor history, notably his monograph on the North Wales miners, as well as numerous articles and edited collections on coal mining history. So welcome, Keith, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thanks, Lachlan. I'm going to try and share my screen, see if I can get this up. Yeah, are we okay with that? Right. Well, yeah, thanks, Lachlan, and thanks everyone for inviting me to give this presentation. I want to talk a bit today about the legacy of the coal mining industry in two areas of the UK, Lancashire and North Wales, but looking at 3 brownfield sites in particular. And what I'm interested in about these sites is looking at them as contested memory spaces. And I think Lachlan touched on this in his introduction, because all three spaces really, in terms of how you find the legacy of coal are both exclusionary and inclusionary, and I'll touch on some of this as I go through the presentation. And what's led me to this really is, as Lachlan's already mentioned, is my original work on coal mining history, and particularly the coal mining history of the post-war period. But in more recent years, I've been tracking the closure of particular coal mines in some of the original areas of research which I was working in. And also, I've got more into the kind of cultural side of things, and this also has had an impact on the memories of deindustrialization, and in particular on the memories of these three sites, which I'll take you through a selection of images. Let me see how I shift this. Just want to work out how I move the slide across. It's not going. There we go. Okay, so the first location, and it's one that James has already touched on, it's in the area of the city of Manchester, the north of England. And this was a former coal mining area, almost in the heart of the city of Manchester. It's about just over a mile east of the city, and this was Bradford Colliery, which you'll see the image on the left there, the black and white image. This was a very large coal mine, and it closed in 1968. And a lot of the miners were dispersed to other mines within the Lancashire coalfield and further afield, particularly in North Wales. So you see the image of the mine there, which dominated the city skyline up until the early 1970s. And then you see the current image there, which some of you might be familiar with, which is Manchester City's football ground, the Etihad Stadium, currently, or were riding high in the current Premiership. I'm not sure where they are now. But you can see there the transformation from this area, which was heavily industrialised, with that coal mine dominating the skyline, to this area of redevelopment. Much of the redevelopment being fueled by the petrodollars coming in through the ownership of Manchester City Football Club. So I've been doing some research around this area, and also unpicking the memories of some of the former miners of Bradford Colliery, but also looking at recent developments in trying to create more static memories and physical memories of coal mining in this district through moves to get some kind of memorial erected, but also to see what happened to some of these mining families from the 1960s and 1970s. And I think this is the point I'd like to stress about this particular location, is where you've got the movement of people out of East Manchester into other areas, particularly to the north of the city, the gentrification of this area around where you see the football stadium now, and as you move into the centre of the city, what's now referred to as the northern quarter. So you've got the process of gentrification, and also in some ways the eradication of the industrial past. Where we do find some of these concrete memories of the industrial past, probably 2 miles north of where the stadium is now, which is the third photograph that you will see there, and that's of the Moston Miners Club. Now that was connected to a coal mine, the Moston Colliery, that closed in 1950. When the mine was closed, a lot of the miners moved to Bradford Colliery, as we'll see in the black and white image there, and a new housing estate was built on that site. And this particular site now, where you see that miners club, this is a community initiative. I think there might be 1 or 2 ex-coal miners still living on that particular estate, but it's really one of these estates that James has already mentioned, which have been stigmatized from without, but also from within the city of Manchester as well. So I think it's a really interesting process here of what's happened to particular brownfield sites, and you see the transformation from Bradford Colliery, that specific location, to the east of the city of Manchester, and then what's happened through the petrodollars coming in and the superpower in terms of global football that Manchester City has now become. But this marginalisation and this shift of particular memories and particular experiences to these more marginal areas in the north of the city. Part of this, again, and I think it links into where I'm at now with the work that I've been recently doing, what has come out of a lot of oral histories of former miners and their families in this particular area was the memories of the popular culture of the 1960s and 1970s. And the fourth image that I've put there on the screen is of the Twisted Wheel Soul Club, which was at the centre of soul music and the performance of African-American artists in the city of Manchester in the mid to late 1960s. I think it finally closes in about 1971. And what comes out of these memories of the twisted wheel, which in itself now has kind of been recognised through various plaques and local heritage initiatives, is the way in which popular music both soundtracked the process of industrialisation, but the way in which popular music also populates the memories of the working classes who lived in these communities and toiled in the collieries like Bradford, as we can see on the image on the left there. So that's the first location that I've been doing work on, which I think you see, you know, what happens, and I think it links to Jana's images as well about the German context, how these industrial landscapes and how these brownfield sites have been developed, all of which, you know, are underpinned by lots of controversy about the use of the land, about what is retained, about the memories that are eradicated through particular processes. And so that's the first location. The second one is about an hour's drive east of Bradford Colliery into Wales. And this is an example from the North Wales coast. This is Point of Ayr Colliery, which had been sunk in the late 19th century and is still producing coal through to 1996. So this is a brownfield site that's undergone recent development, and there's some interesting battles going on here, because this particular coalfield and this location, Point of Ayr Colliery, was one that was divided during the industrial disputes of the 1980s. And what you see with this brownfield site is the way it's been developed for mixed use, but also the former miners themselves have been able to hold on to a section of this location and develop their own heritage projects. So the third image you see there is the former headgear of Point of Ayr Colliery, which was preserved by local history groups and now is erected close to the site of the former colliery. So in the 10 or 15 years since the colliery closed in 1996, there have been these successful initiatives. So as I said, the location has three different uses now. So one part of the site is now developing wind turbines, so it really embracing kind of new technologies in terms of power generation, quite successfully in that area. And the second use is for tourism and recreation. It's very close to a number of beaches. I think it's on the Dee estuary, opening out into the Irish Sea. And also there's a local mining heritage trail. The point about this, and again, I think this is interesting about these brownfield sites as being spaces of contested memories, because one of the internal battles that's been taking place here is about what kind of mining history is preserved. And there's a section of former miners, around 70 to 80 of them, who are very critical of the way in which the heritage trail and the memories of a mining past have been preserved. And their view is that a lot of this history has been completely sanitized and depoliticized. So there has been a local campaign from this group of miners to get some kind of recognition for the role that they played in the 1984-85 dispute. And I've traced some of those tensions within these heritage groups and within these particular communities. What also struck me in this case, and again, very much like the Bradford case in Manchester, was the importance of popular music again in both soundtracking the process of deindustrialization and also this embrace of particular genres of popular music. In this case, as in the Twisted Wheel case, the club that I've just shown you, this the popularity of Northern Soul music. I've just pulled out one poster there. That's from the Dixieland Club, which was located on the pier in Colwyn Bay, which is a coastal resort not far from Point of Ayr Colliery. And again, these memories of popular music and the cultural life of coal mining is something that have signposted the oral histories and the testimonies that I've been involved in extracting from some of these heritage groups in this particular area. So the final example, moving back into England from Wales, but as I said at the outset of this, the kind of geographical location is quite close. You can drive from Manchester to Point of Ayr, North Wales, in 1 hour. This example, Bickershaw Colliery, was located about 10 miles west of the city of Manchester. Yeah, thanks, Lachlan. And again, you see a similar process here, but in the case of Bickershaw, there's been no mining heritage initiatives at all, and that this is again underpinned by similar tensions. You see the original picture of the Bickershaw Colliery there. This one closed in 1992. The next image is of what's happened to the location now. It's quite expensive housing, quite large houses, doesn't really reflect the the local population living in those areas. Certainly a lot of people in those areas couldn't afford to live there. The Lee Miners Welfare Club is still open, but also that's been privatized now, so it no longer has any links to the industry or to the Lancashire area of the National Union of Mine Workers. So again here, you know, we see some divisions about really trying to generate some recognition for a mining past, and I've been involved with some of the groups involved in this. So I'll just wrap up there. Lots more obviously to talk about, but if you're interested in the project that I'm involved in, and Andrew Perchard's involved in more generally, we have a website, Community, where we have some primary sources there and talk about some of these issues in a bit more detail. Thanks.
Yeah, bravo, Keith. Thanks very much for a great presentation. Those issues of identity and memory and contested ways that heritage is presented on these sites, I think, are key to how we consider brownfield sites and the way that they're treated, right? Yeah, so thank you for the great presentation. So yeah, so we're moving on now to our final presentation of the day before we get into a question and answer session. So I'd like to welcome our final panelist, Andrew Perchard. Andy is a professor of industry and society at Newcastle Business School at Northumbria University. And his current research examines deindustrialization and the British coal industry. He's also an editor of the History Workshop Journal, and he's published widely on deindustrialization in the UK, including the coal industry, as well as a monograph on the history of aluminium production in the Scottish Highlands, a really great book. So welcome, Andy. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Lachlan and everyone. So hopefully you can see my slides here. So I'm going to talk about the idea of brownfield from a slightly different point of view, but picking up on some of the points that have been raised both by Stephen and also by James as well, about stigmatization, in this case, in the idea around peripheralized regions, and talking about, in particularly, Scotland's Highlands and Islands. And here I'm picking up on the point that Kathy Stanton raised about this idea of a continuum between the industrial, the deindustrialized and the post-industrial, and talking about a continually shifting landscape. So the point about the Highlands and Islands, so that we've got a map on this slide, which in some ways captures part of this debate, is the area historically defined by what we call the 7 crofting counties, which in some ways speaks to a key issue about the way in which the Highlands has been defined, which has been around land issues and around the whole idea of wildness. So, and it's an important theme to come back to in terms of the economic narratives, which have therefore shaped how people think about the area and about industrialization and deindustrialization. So I'll start with a comment made by the sociologist David McCrone in 1992 in his book, Understanding Scotland, the Sociology of a Nation. And he said, if treating Scotland as a whole, as peripheral and underdeveloped, is somewhat problematic, it is the Highlands of Scotland which have attracted the description most often. There is the added irony that the Highlands provide many of the images and meanings for Scotland as a whole in the late 20th century. About a decade later, he then said, Scotland is dominated by 2 cultural landscapes. On the one hand, it is a peopleless place, reflected in its rural, essentially Highland image of empty spaces, as if no one has ever lived there. So I'm going to stop with that. And then he talks about populated cities. The idea being, in McCrone's point, and that has come through in a lot of narratives, is of the Highlands as a wild, peopleless place, a place devoid of industry. So let me move on. So the next thing I want to talk about, I'm going to focus particularly on some of the economic narratives around this rather than the cultural, which have deep-seated historical roots as well. So to give you an illustration of this, in 1907, the American geographer Ralph Stockman Tarr was touring the Highlands and Islands, and concluded by saying it was an unproductive region, lacking in a basis for development of a high degree of enterprise. One of the places that Stockman Tarr was walking past was Loch Leven, and at the head of Loch Leven, at exactly the time he was traveling by, this massive hydroelectric scheme, an aluminium smelter and an industrial village was being built in a place that was called Kinloch Leven, head of the Loch Leven. In fact, the company, so we get a view down the hydro pipelines here, the company was so enthusiastic, they actually wanted to call the town Aluminiumville. But so this town, this village that grew up in the factory and hydro works were part of a massive human web that accompanied the global supply chain of aluminium. Amongst the workers who started working in the early factory there, which opened in 1907, were workers from a nearby slate quarry in Ballachulish, which had been opened in the 1690s, that had been blacklisted after a strike in 1902 to 1905. So the point I'm trying to make here is these are indicators of a long tradition of industrialization in the region. However, the idea that the region lacked industry was perpetuated in economic narratives, including ones like these. This is by a St Andrews economist writing for the Board of Agriculture, the government's Board of Agriculture for Scotland in 1914. Again, this is suffused with the idea of it as a backward region, one that would be best encouraging people to move out of. Again, a narrative that was continued into the 1960s as well. So in the popular photojournalistic magazine, The Picture Post, described the Highlands and Islands in the 1950s as Britain's most gravely depressed area. And the second quote from two prominent economists, the same year that the government launched a new economic generation agency for the Highlands and Islands, suggested again that the most economic solution to the Highland problem was to encourage people to leave the area. So such narratives were also reflected within government circles as well. The head of the civil service in Scotland in the 1960s was reputed to have, while standing over a map of the Highlands and Islands, swept his hand across it and said, the best thing that can be done for this area is to chuck buns across the fence. Even more damaging in the 80s, the former chairman of the Economic Generation Agency, the Highlands and Islands Development Board, Sir Robert Grieve, said on a Scottish TV programme in 1978, Glasgow is one joker in the pack, the Highlands are the other. So this flies in the face of what was really going on in the region. There had been industrialization from the late 17th century on, from iron foundries, coal mining, engineering, shipbuilding, and aluminium smelting, often as part of global supply chains. But the point is that this economic narrative endured. So to give an idea of just how much was going on, if we look at this, hopefully can make some of this out. This is just from the 1890s to 2014. The Highlands and Islands was actually heavily involved in various industrial developments and also experienced closures too. As economic historian Morven Yervin has observed to the framing of pervasive rhetoric around African economic development and equally damaging methods that accompany that, such narratives are pernicious. For the Highlands and Islands then, that economic narrative is of a developing and peripheral region. Similar stereotypes were forged of Western Norway as well. The point being, much in a similar way to deindustrialized areas that have seen a narrative of stigmatization around them, is the comment that British trade unionist and Labour Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin made in the 30s about depressed areas, which is, it is of no great inducement to anybody to open a business when you tell him he is going to a place where there is a depression. So to use Sherry Lincoln and John Rousseau's phrase, the Highlands and Islands as a region amongst economists and policymakers was already defined as a poster child of decline. Alongside this, though, with some of the closures, such as at Invergordon, was a narrative that coupled it to similarities in lowland Scotland. For example, Invergordon, also the Wiggins Teat pulp and paper mill in Corpach in the West Highlands, which both bore out some similarities with some closures in lowland Scotland, such as the Chrysler car plant in Linwood and the BMC plant at Bathgate, in terms of the failings of regional industrial policy. But a lot of these closures took place beneath the public radar with the Highlands and Islands, so that they did not figure in the public narrative in the same way that lowland closures did, with the exception of Invergordon. But a further connection, though, in terms of this human web that we can talk about, is that a lot of these plants also employed itinerant workers who'd come from areas like the shipyards of the Clyde and Dundee, and then were re-employed in places like Invergordon, or with the oil and gas boom in the fabrication yards at Nig on the Cromarty Firth, at Kishorn and Westeros as well, where fabrication yards were built, only then to relocate, to be made redundant again from these industries. So there are waves of development, waves of deindustrialization going on with workers who are itinerant and their families, of course. And an important feature of this, I think, to emphasize, that we've been trying to pick out, a number of us, work like Lachlan's, that Christine Wally's work, that we're trying to pick out in the coal project as well, is to look at the experiences of kids of deindustrialization too, especially as of itinerant families within that. So I want to wrap up now by just talking about the importance of this as another dimension to this complex range of interactions within our consideration of the industrial, the deindustrial, and the post-industrial, and as part of global supply chains as well, and about how peripheralized regions often go through these various stages, but that can take place because of development narratives beneath the public radar. So I've provided a few images here of just some of the sites that we're talking about, and quickly in terms of brownfield. So on the Invergordon site, at the top of the picture, you'll see the smelter and the aluminium smelter in the background. Now that site, when I visited that a decade ago, that site still had, while some of the buildings had been demolished, it was largely being used still as an industrial site with various engineering works being produced there. The area of Invergordon had been through several waves of closure, from naval dockyards to whiskey bond houses, and you can see some refinery there. It's still the fabrication yards as well. The old naval dockyards are still used on decommissioning rigs. And here, if we look at Kisshorn, and the same's true of the Nig yards, these have now been converted in the move from oil and gas platforms to offshore renewables. So the computer generated issue in the middle on the bottom here is of Kisshorn, that it was the planning permission images for both decommissioning oil and gas platforms and for building offshore renewables. And the final picture down in the bottom here is a picture that I took in Kinlochleven as a village now, which still, you can still see the pipelines because the hydroelectricity is now used on the grid, but much of the factory has been demolished and is now partly a brewery and also an ice climbing wall. And the top center image is of one of the Highland protests about closures there, including Invergordon, and Invergordon being a prominent name amongst another litany of other closures in Scotland. And I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andy. Yeah, so Stephen wrote an interesting comment in the chat where he remarks that the Scottish example seems to be quite similar to that in Nova Scotia. He references the work of Ian Mackay, the book The Quest of the Folk, where he looks at how deindustrialization opened the way to kind of presentations of the region as rural or pastoral, and indeed Scottish as well, right? Drawing upon that kind of notion of the history of that region, which of course is an interesting point to raise. But right now, I think that